there is one detail, almost easy to miss, confirmed by CNN on the night of February 28, 2026, as Iranian missiles were intercepted in the skies above Dubai, and yet that single detail quietly reveals more about the true nature of the city than any record-breaking tower or luxury headline ever could. Dubai has no public bomb shelters. At first, it sounds like a minor oversight, but in the exact moment when sirens began to echo across the city, when interception systems lit up the sky above Palm Jumeirah, when debris struck the Fairmont Hotel and ignited a fire, when smoke rose near both the Burj Al Arab and the Burj Khalifa, and when Dubai International Airport was hit and forced into evacuation, that absence stopped being a detail. It became the story, because in that moment, a city of 4 million people found itself facing something it had never truly prepared for. Not economically, not structurally, and not psychologically. There was no designed response, no built-in refuge, no system waiting beneath the surface for when everything above it started to break. And what that reveals is not just what happened that night, but what Dubai was actually built for from the very beginning. And when that moment arrived, there was no time left to question anything. And in the middle of it all, one reality became impossible to ignore. There was nowhere designed for people to go, so people improvised. Across the city, underground parking garages became shelters. Spaces built for cars were suddenly filled with families looking for safety, and inside those spaces, a quieter moment unfolded. Parents told their children that the explosions above were Ramadan cannon fire, the familiar sound of iftar. They replaced fear with something recognizable, even if only for a moment. But outside, the meaning of those sounds never changed. This was not celebration. It was war. And then, almost suddenly, everything went quiet. The next day, CNN videographer Paul Devitt described the feeling from Abu Dhabi in a way that stayed with many people. It felt like the days of COVID, strangely calm, almost unreal. The sun was out, birds could be heard, but something essential was missing. No traffic, no planes, no movement. Dubai, a city defined by constant motion, had come to a stop. Highways that should have been packed in February, peak season, were empty. Beach clubs just stood still. JBR, usually crowded with tourists, felt almost deserted on a Sunday. And that silence is where the real story begins. Because this is not about missiles, or even about the night itself. It is about what those empty streets reveal when everything else disappears. To understand that, you have to look at what people did next. When the airspace closed on February 28th, leaving stopped being a choice and became a problem. Thousands of people who lived in Dubai and wanted to leave suddenly couldn't. The same system that usually makes the city feel effortless, fast flights, global connections, constant movement, had shut down at the exact moment people needed it most. And when movement disappears, pressure builds immediately. By March 3rd, 2026, private jet charters were being quoted at $250,000. That wasn't just a price, it was a signal. Leaving was still possible, but only for a very specific group of people. For everyone else, the reality looked very different. Some chose to drive for hours across the desert, heading toward the Oman border. Taxi drivers were reportedly charging $800 for a 4.5-hour journey to Muscat. It was not convenient, not comfortable, but it was one of the few remaining exits. At the same time, governments began to react. Western countries issued formal advice to their citizens: leave or do not travel. Companies started evacuating employees. The U.S. State Department told American citizens to depart from Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, and Qatar. And as all of this was happening, while people were calculating routes, checking flights, making decisions about whether to stay or go, the atmosphere in the city began to shift in a quieter way. Because leaving was not just about logistics, it was about what people were willing to take with them, and what they were willing to leave behind. And that is where the story takes a different turn. As people rushed to leave, another pattern began to appear. At first, it was scattered. Easy to miss if you weren't looking closely, but then it became impossible to ignore. Pets were being abandoned. Dogs were found tied to lampposts across different neighborhoods. Others were left behind in empty apartments. Some were brought to animal shelters that were already overwhelmed, unable to handle the sudden increase. Veterinarians described being flooded with requests for euthanasia, and as images and reports began to circulate, the reaction was immediate. Anger, outrage, a sense that something deeply wrong had just been exposed. Dominic Dyer, a prominent animal welfare advocate, documented what was happening. After the missile strikes, he explained, thousands of expatriates rushed to leave Dubai. And as flights filled, a quieter crisis unfolded. Hundreds of pets were left behind. Many of the people involved were the same ones who had spent years presenting their Dubai lifestyle online. The contrast was hard to ignore. and the response reflected that. But stopping at outrage misses the deeper point. Because what happened to those animals is not just a story about individual behavior, it is a reflection of something much larger. And to see that clearly, you have to step back and look at how the city itself is designed. Because Dubai has always attracted a very specific kind of relationship between people and place. Most people who come here are not coming to stay forever. They arrive for something defined, a career opportunity, a financial goal, a phase of life that exists within a clear window of time. And when that window closes, they leave. That alone is not unusual. What makes Dubai different is that this pattern is not just common, it is structured into the system itself. The city is not built around long-term attachment, it is built around flow, around movement, around the idea that people will arrive, participate, and eventually move on without ever fully becoming part of something permanent. And as long as conditions remain stable, that model feels almost invisible. Because when everything works, when the flights are running, when the economy is strong, when the environment feels controlled, temporariness does not feel like a weakness. It feels like flexibility. But that perception depends entirely on one assumption. That stability will continue. The moment that assumption breaks, even slightly, the nature of the system begins to reveal itself, not through theory, but through behavior. Because when uncertainty enters a system built on temporary presence, people do not hesitate in the same way. They do not anchor, they assess, and then they decide. And in Dubai, that decision follows a pattern that has always been there, just rarely tested under pressure. People leave. But what happened in March 2026 did not come out of nowhere. The empty streets, the sudden silence, the way people reacted, those were not isolated events, but the visible side of pressures that had already been building long before the missiles arrived. Just 12 months earlier, in early 2025, Dubai was facing the opposite problem. The city was not empty, it was overcrowded. So much so that Habib al-Mullah, a prominent Emirati lawyer, publicly raised concerns about traffic congestion, something that carries weight in a system where public criticism is not common and is usually expressed carefully. He stated that Dubai's traffic situation required both immediate and long-term solutions, later describing congestion as one of the major challenges facing global cities like Dubai. And this was not just opinion. The data confirmed it. According to the TomTom Traffic Index, drivers in Dubai lost 72 hours to traffic congestion in 2025, which is the equivalent of 3 full days spent sitting in traffic over the course of a year. At the same time, the city added 223,000 new residents in just 1 year, bringing the total population to 4 million, while more than 1,000 new vehicles were being registered every single day. To keep up, the Roads and Transport Authority launched 57 major infrastructure projects, including 226 kilometers of new roads and 115 bridges and tunnels. And yet, despite all of that expansion, congestion continued to worsen, because the city was growing faster than its systems could handle. Rachel Dodds, a professor of tourism at Toronto Metropolitan University, had already warned about this, explaining that service levels would eventually decline because growth was outpacing capacity, and that at a certain point, Dubai would no longer be able to deliver the luxury experience it promised, and by then, recovery would not be possible. That was the reality before the crisis. A city expanding rapidly, building aggressively, and maintaining an image of seamless luxury, while underneath the pressure was already there. And then suddenly everything stopped. And when everything stopped, that is when the contrast became impossible to ignore. Because in the silence of those empty streets, you could see two realities at the same time. On one side, everything that had been built was still there. The roads, the towers, the infrastructure, the scale of ambition that had defined Dubai for years. But on the other side, something else became visible. How fragile that system actually was. Because what the missiles exposed was not just a moment of crisis, but a structural truth that had always been there. Dubai was built to support global movement, not long-term permanence. It was designed to be one of the most efficient places in the world to arrive, to work, to build, and to leave, but not necessarily a place where people are deeply rooted when things become difficult. And under normal conditions, that design feels like an advantage. It makes the city fast, flexible, open to the world. But when those conditions break, even briefly, the same design begins to show its limitations. Because a system built around movement depends on movement continuing. And when movement stops, what is left behind is not stability, it is exposure. Because this is not just an observation about how the city feels, but something built into how Dubai actually works, where around 89% of the population are expatriates and only about 11% are Emirati nationals, while nearly 90% of the workforce are non-citizens. meaning the entire system depends on people who are, by design, temporary rather than permanent members of society. Because permanence is not easily accessible, as citizenship requires around 30 years of residency, Arabic fluency, a clean record, and government nomination, and even then is granted selectively, reinforcing that most people are not expected to stay indefinitely. And this is not a flaw, it is the system. A structure designed to attract global talent and opportunity while maintaining control over long-term belonging, where people are offered income, lifestyle, and possibility, but not necessarily permanence. And as long as everything works, that system feels stable. But the moment conditions begin to change, it reveals exactly what it was built to do. And when you place all of this together, the structure of the city, the temporary nature of the people within it, and the way the system responds the moment stability is disrupted, what happened during those days stops feeling like a series of extreme events and starts to look like the natural outcome of a system operating under pressure. Because the people who left on $250,000 private jets and the people who abandoned their pets, while appearing completely different in terms of wealth, choices, and circumstances, were in reality responding to the same underlying logic of the environment they were part of, a system where presence was always temporary, where attachment was never deeply required, and where leaving was not a failure, but an expected outcome. And when that kind of system is suddenly pushed into uncertainty, when the conditions that normally keep everything stable begin to weaken, people do not need to be told what to do, because they are simply following the structure they have always existed within, assessing the risk, making a decision, and acting accordingly. And in that moment, what you see is not a breakdown of behavior, but a reflection of design. Because people do not suddenly become different. They respond exactly as the system allows them to. And that is why what happened was not an exception. It was a pattern that had always been there, but only becomes visible when it is tested. And yet, even after everything that happened, this is not the first time Dubai has gone through a moment like this. Because the city has experienced shocks before where large numbers of people left in a short period of time, most notably in 2020 when the population dropped by 8.4%, the steepest decline in the Gulf, as tens of thousands of expatriate workers exited once the safety net disappeared, which is what typically happens in a system where most people are not citizens. And what followed after that is just as important as the drop itself, because within 2 years, the numbers returned, tourism recovered, investment came back, and the city filled up again, showing that Dubai has a very real and proven ability to rebuild demand and attract people back once conditions stabilize. Because the system is extremely good at restarting itself. It knows how to bring people back in. It knows how to make the city move again. But rebuilding demand is not the same as building resilience, and those two things do not always come together. Because demand returns for a reason, as the offer itself does not disappear. The infrastructure remains, the connectivity returns when airspace opens, the tax advantages are still there, and the lifestyle that attracts people in the first place continues to exist, which is why people eventually come back. But what does not automatically return is something deeper. The willingness to stay when conditions are no longer ideal. The sense of belonging that makes people hold on instead of leave. Because a city is not only defined by how many people it can attract when everything is working, it is defined by what happens when things are not. And that is where the real question begins. What actually holds Dubai together when the promise it was built on starts to break?